Under the blazing Anatolian sun, a weary column of knights marched with their wagons, unaware of the storm about to descend. Suddenly the ground shook and the sky darkened. Tens of thousands of Seljuk horsemen thundered down, unleashing a hail of arrows that turned day into night. Fires consumed tents, screams filled the air, and the Crusader vanguard stood on the edge of destruction. Yet they did not break. Shield by shield, line by line, they held against the storm. Hours passed in blood and fire, until at last, their reinforcements thundered over the hills. The hunters became the hunted. Surrounded on all sides, the mighty Seljuk army collapsed in panic, fleeing before the iron charge of the Crusaders. From near annihilation came triumph. The cross had prevailed, and victory belonged to the Crusaders. In the summer of 1097, Anatolia stood on the brink of chaos. After the crushing loss of Nicaea, Sultan Kilij Arslan I of the Seljuks felt his honor torn to shreds. To him, the fall of Nicaea was not merely the loss of a fortress, it was a humiliation before the entire Muslim world. The Sultan, once dismissive of the Crusaders as little more than a band of unruly Western knights, now realized he faced a disciplined force blessed with dangerous determination. His pride wounded and his power questioned, Kilij Arslan vowed revenge. He rallied 20,000 to 30,000 mounted warriors, the pride of the Seljuk Sultanate. These were not heavy knights clad in iron, but swift horse archers, trained since childhood to rain death from afar with their powerful composite bows. Their armor was light, leather and mail, allowing unmatched speed. Their tactic was simple yet lethal. Strike fast, unleash storms of arrows, and vanish before the enemy's counterattack. On the open plains of Anatolia, speed was their greatest weapon. Across the battlefield marched the Crusader host, numbering around 35,000 to 40,000 souls. Among them were 4,500 to 5,000 heavy knights, men encased in steel who fought with long lances, broadswords, and unwavering faith. Behind them came infantry, lighter cavalry, priests, camp followers, and lumbering supply wagons. Their strength lay in discipline, steel, and faith, for these warriors believed they marched under the eye of God himself. Yet their weakness was equally clear. Their column was slow, their formation clumsy, and their survival depended on fragile supply lines stretched across hostile lands. The leaders of the Crusaders were men of ambition and cunning. Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman hardened in the wars of southern Italy, was sharp and decisive. Robert of Normandy and Stephen of Blois commanded with courage, though lacking Bohemond's ruthlessness. Further behind marched the might of the Crusade, Godfrey of Bouillon, steadfast and unyielding, Raymond IV of Toulouse, experienced and shrewd, and Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, the spiritual heart of the army. But a fatal decision had been made. To ease the strain of supply, the Crusaders had split their forces in two columns. This division was the very opening Kilij Arslan craved. Like a hawk circling its prey, he prepared to descend upon the vanguard at Dorylaeum, aiming to annihilate them before the rest could come to their aid. One side brought the storm of arrows and speed of the desert winds. The other carried the iron discipline and faith of the West. When these two forces clashed, the soil of Anatolia would be drowned in blood, and the fate of the crusade itself would hang by a thread. On the early morning of July 1st, 1097, the vanguard of the Crusader army reached the plains near Dorylaeum and set up camp beside a river. This vanguard was led by Bohemond of Taranto, Robert of Normandy, and Stephen of Blois. Their men were exhausted after days of marching under the scorching Anatolian sun. The supply wagons creaked heavily, and even the horses staggered under their burdens. Unknown to them, Sultan Kilij Arslan I had been watching, waiting. Hidden among the hills and ridges surrounding the plain, tens of thousands of Seljuk horsemen were poised for attack. The Sultan had chosen his moment perfectly. The Crusader forces were divided, and the vanguard was isolated far from the rear guard. Then, without warning, the silence of the plain was shattered. The ground shook as 20,000 to 30,000 Seljuk cavalry poured down from the hills. Their charge thundered like an avalanche, and before the Crusaders could react, the sky darkened. A storm of arrows whistled overhead, blotting out the sun. Men and horses fell in droves. The cries of the wounded filled the camp. The Seljuks fought with terrifying precision. They did not charge headlong into the Crusader lines. Instead, they circled the camp at speed, loosing arrows as they rode, then wheeling away before the knights could strike back. Fires broke out as arrows tipped with pitch and oil set tents and supply wagons ablaze. Panic spread. Civilians, women, children, and camp followers screamed as chaos engulfed the camp. Knights scrambled to mount their horses, infantry clutched their shields, priests prayed aloud. Everywhere, confusion reigned. But in the midst of the chaos, the Crusader commanders acted with desperate resolve. Bohemond ordered the knights to form a defensive line, shields locked together into a wall of wood and iron. Robert of Normandy rushed to protect the baggage train, shouting commands drowned out by the roar of hooves and screams. Stephen of Blois tried to rally stragglers, holding the line inch by inch. The Crusaders were badly outnumbered. Their formation wavered under the relentless rain of arrows, and each moment it seemed certain they would be crushed. Yet still they clung to their faith. To retreat was to abandon the cross, to break their holy vow. They stood, bloodied but unyielding, praying for the rear guard to arrive before it was too late. At Dorylaeum, in those desperate hours, the crusade itself seemed on the brink of destruction. The camp of the Crusaders was no longer a place of rest. It had turned into a furnace of terror and steel. Arrows rained down without pause, the sound of shafts striking shields like the pounding of war drums. Every few seconds, a scream pierced the air as another man or horse fell. The Seljuks fought like a storm. Their horsemen never stopped moving, circling the Crusader camp in endless waves. From afar, they fired arrow after arrow, the black cloud above growing thicker. Then, with terrifying swiftness, small groups would break off, swoop down, and slash with curved sabers before pulling away again. They struck like wolves, isolate the weak, overwhelm them, and vanish before retaliation. Inside the camp, chaos spread. Wagons burned as fire arrows struck, filling the air with choking smoke. Women and children screamed, pressed against overturned carts. Camp followers tried to flee, only to be chased by riders who cut them down without mercy. The Crusaders realized this was not only a battle for their army, it was a fight for their families, their very survival. Bohemond, his voice hoarse from shouting, ordered his knights to form tight lines. Shields overlapped, spears thrust outward. Robert of Normandy and Stephen of Blois scrambled to hold the supply train, knowing that if the wagons fell, starvation would finish them, even if the Seljuks did not. Every command was drowned out by the roar of hooves, the hiss of arrows, the screams of the dying. Time and again, knights tried to charge, lowering their heavy lances. With brutal force, they struck down Seljuk riders, armor smashing into leather and bone. But the enemy never stood still. The Seljuks melted away like smoke, regrouping, and then another wave came. It was like fighting the wind itself, impossible to catch, impossible to stop. Yet even in the heart of despair, courage blazed. A band of Norman knights, bloodied and exhausted, lowered their banners and hurled themselves into the fray. They crashed into a cluster of Seljuk riders, swords flashing, axes hacking. The clash scattered the enemy for moments, buying precious time. But soon the circle tightened again. The Seljuks regrouped, surrounding the knights, arrows and sabers closing in. Hours dragged on. The Crusaders' shields grew heavy with arrows. Their arms ached, their mouths dry with thirst. And still, they did not break. Every heartbeat was a defiance. Every desperate blow, a prayer for survival. At Dorylaeum, the crusade balanced on the edge of annihilation. For most of the morning, the Crusader vanguard had stood at the very brink of destruction. Their camp was burning, their soldiers weary and bloodied, and their shields heavy with arrows. Every minute felt like the end was near. The Seljuks tightened the noose, their riders shouting with triumph. their arrows falling like rain. Victory seemed certain, but then a new sound rose above the chaos. At first it was faint, like distant thunder rolling across the hills. Yet with each heartbeat it grew louder. The ground shook again, but this time not with the fury of Seljuk hooves. It was the armored march of the Crusader rear guard. Over the ridges they came. Godfrey of Bouillon led the charge, his banner of the cross blazing against the smoke-darkened sky. To his right rode Raymond of Toulouse, grim and determined, and beside him, the towering figure of Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, the spiritual leader of the crusade. Their troops were fresh, their armor gleaming, their lances lowered. They had marched hard to catch up, and now they struck like a hammer. The Seljuks, so confident a moment before, faltered. They wheeled about to face this new enemy, but suddenly the hunters were trapped. From the camp, the battered vanguard of Bohemond, Robert and Stephen surged outward, roaring with desperate fury. From behind, Godfrey's knights thundered forward, their charge shaking the earth. It was as if the jaws of a great beast had closed. The Seljuk cavalry, once free to circle and harass, now found themselves pressed on both sides. Their arrows lost their sting when there was no room to maneuver. Crusader lances tore into their flanks. Shields clashed. Swords and axes struck with bone-crushing force. The plain of Dorylaeum erupted with chaos. Horses screamed, men shouted in terror, banners toppled into the dust. Panic spread like wildfire through the Seljuk ranks. The disciplined ferocity of the Crusaders, united at last, turned the tide in a single breathtaking moment. What had begun as near annihilation for the Crusaders now became the chance for triumph. At Dorylaeum, the balance of war shifted, not slowly but with the force of thunder. The battlefield of Dorylaeum was unrecognizable. What had begun as a carefully planned ambush had turned into chaos. The Seljuk cavalry, once so confident, now found themselves squeezed between two walls of iron. The sound of hooves pounding had changed, from the rhythm of the hunt to the desperate scramble of prey. At first, their commanders tried to rally. Trumpets blared, riders shouted, urging their men to form a line, to turn and fight. Small clusters of Seljuk horsemen wheeled about, loosing arrows and charging with sabers raised. For a moment they struck back, blades flashing, arrows cutting down a few Crusaders. But the counterattack collapsed as quickly as it began. The Crusader knights, heavy in armor and unyielding in formation, smashed through their thin defenses. Spears skewered riders, swords cut down those who lingered, and the Seljuk banners fell one by one into the dust. Then the panic spread. One rider fled, then another, and soon entire groups were galloping away. The field became a torrent of frightened men, spurring their horses to the limit, trying to escape the tightening jaws of the Crusader army. The Crusaders pursued with merciless determination. Heavy cavalry thundered across the plain, lances lowered, trampling through bodies and scattering survivors. Infantry poured out of the camp, chasing the stragglers with spears and axes. Even the once weary vanguard found new strength, driven by rage and relief, cutting down their tormentors as they fled. The Seljuks, masters of the ambush, were now helpless. Their speed meant nothing when there was no room to maneuver. The open field that had favored their arrows became a killing ground for the Crusader charge. All morning they had hunted, but now they were hunted in turn. By midday the rout was complete. The Seljuk army dissolved into fleeing fragments, scattering across the plains of Anatolia. Behind them lay the wreckage of their failed ambush. Broken arrows, abandoned horses, shattered banners, and the bodies of thousands. At Dorylaeum, the proud hunters of the morning had become the desperate prey of the afternoon. By the late afternoon of July 1st, 1097, the battlefield of Dorylaeum had fallen silent. Where once the thunder of hooves and the clash of steel had echoed, now only groans of the wounded and the cries of frightened animals remained. Smoke rose from burned wagons and shattered tents, drifting above a field littered with broken arrows, torn banners, and countless bodies. The Seljuks, who had begun the day with confidence, were utterly broken. Thousands lay dead on the plain. Those who survived fled into the hills and deserts, abandoning both the battlefield and their honor. The mighty ambush that Sultan Kili Arslan the First had prepared so carefully had ended not in triumph, but in disaster. Once more his prestige was shattered, and his control over Anatolia began to unravel. For the Crusaders, it was nothing short of miraculous. In the morning, they had faced annihilation. The vanguard, isolated and pressed on all sides, had fought desperately for hours under storms of arrows. Yet they had not broken. Their faith and discipline held, and when the rear guard finally arrived, the two halves of the army united in a crushing counterattack. What had been certain defeat turned into a sweeping victory. That night, the Crusader camp was filled not with fear, but with relief and celebration. Soldiers embraced one another, priests led hymns of thanksgiving, and knights spoke of how God himself must have guided them through the fire. For many, Dorylaeum became proof that their holy cause was blessed. The consequences of this battle were immense. The Seljuk threat in western Anatolia was broken. Kilij Arslan could no longer hope to destroy the Crusaders with one decisive blow. Instead, the way forward, deeper into Asia Minor, lay open. From here, the Crusaders would march to Antioch and eventually to Jerusalem itself. But beyond strategy, the victory carried a deeper meaning. It showed the Crusaders that even against overwhelming odds, against faster, more numerous foes, they could survive and triumph if they stood together. Dorylaeum became a rallying cry, a legend whispered by campfires as the army pressed ever onward. The fields that had nearly become their grave now became the birthplace of their legend. At Dorylaeum, death had seemed certain, but from its shadow, the light of victory shone brighter than ever.